Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to Biblical Reality Check. Today we're exploring the story of the Tower of Babel, found in Genesis chapter 11, not as a children's tale about a tall tower, but as a psychological and metaphysical case study in collective folly. Babel is what happens when a group of people forget who they are, forget where meaning comes from, and try to manufacture significance through scale, spectacle, and self-importance. It's the moment when a society or culture becomes so obsessed with its own beliefs and creations that it loses coherence with reality itself. As will become clear, Babel isn't ancient history, it's a mirror. Story opens with the following line, quote, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words," unquote. Unlike most interpretations, I do not believe this verse is describing unity. I think it's describing uniformity. There is a difference. Unity is voluntary. It's what happens when alignment is voluntarily chosen. But this verse doesn't mention aligned purpose, harmony, or relational cohesion. Instead, it's describing a collapse of differentiation. Everyone speaks the same way, uses the same vocabulary, expresses themselves through the same channel. That's not unity, that's uniformity, sameness imposed over diversity. A groupthink of thought. To further clarify the difference between unity and uniformity, let's look at the Hebrew. The Hebrew phrase translated as one language literally means one lip or a single mode of expression. And the Hebrew phrase translated as the same words literally means words that are not just shared, but identical. The verse is emphasizing sameness, not harmony. It's describing a psyche or a society where nuance has been flattened, plurality has been erased, and only one acceptable pattern of speech remains. In other words, the story opens not with unity, but with the warning sign that uniformity has taken over. Babel is a society that has collapsed into a single worldview, a single narrative. They're speaking with one voice, and there's no diversity of opinion or thought. When everyone thinks the same way, speaks the same way, and chases the same goals, something subtle but dangerous happens. Discernment dies, wisdom evaporates, and folly becomes invisible. This is the psychological soil in which Babel grows. This chart shows the difference between a society built on collective wisdom and one driven by collective ego. And it's the perfect lens for understanding what's happening with Babel. On the left, collective wisdom is what true unity looks like. Diverse perspectives, slow and sustainable building, clear communication, and structures that serve people. On the right, collective ego is what uniformity produces. Sameness enforced from the top, impulsive reactions, slogans instead of substance, and structures people are forced to serve. The point of the comparison is simple. Aligned societies grow from truth and internal coherence, while misaligned societies chase visibility, dominance, and spectacle. Babel isn't the story of a unified people. It's the story of a society that has collapsed into collective ego, mistaking uniformity for strength and unity. The story goes on to say in Genesis 11:4 that the people decide to build a tower reaching to the heavens so they can make a name for themselves. This isn't architecture, this is identity construction. The tower is the ego scaled up to a collective level. It's humanity trying to outrun its own insecurity. The people in Babel are the inverse of the teacher in Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes, the teacher discovers that meaning cannot be built on anything external. In Babel, the people try anyway. They attempt to engineer significance through appearances, reputation, and spectacle. It's the same mistake the ego makes on an individual level, just multiplied by thousands of people who all agree on the same delusion. I think the best way to put it is that collective folly is simply individual folly with a marketing department. Verses 5 to 8 are a little bit hard to understand, but stick with me. They say, quote, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had built. Then the Lord said, if now, while they are one people and all have the same language, they have started to do this, nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach." When God says nothing they presume to do will be out of their reach, God's not praising their potential. The God in this story is diagnosing a psychological collapse. The people of Babel are not unified, as we've established, they're uniform. And uniformity is the breeding ground for groupthink, where dissent disappears and the collective mind becomes incapable of questioning its own direction. In that state, a society or an individual psyche can carry out any impulse it generates, no matter how misguided, because nothing inside it is resisting. The danger isn't that they can achieve anything, it's that they can justify anything. That's why the intervention comes immediately, not to limit human potential, but to restore plurality, the very thing that makes discernment and therefore wisdom possible. Text goes on to say, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that no one will understand the speech of another." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. When the text says, quote, "so that no one will understand the speech of another," unquote, it isn't describing God inventing new dialects out of nowhere. It's describing the restoration of differentiation inside the psyche or a society that has collapsed into total uniformity. In the state of groupthink, everyone mirrors the same thoughts, the same slogans, the same emotional tone. They understand each other perfectly because they're not actually thinking, they're repeating. So when God confuses their language, what's really being restored is the ability to think differently, to interpret differently, to question, to disagree, to see from another angle. Suddenly, people no longer automatically accept and parrot the dominant narrative. The spell breaks. Once diversity of thought returns, the project built on uniformity collapses on its own. The people of Babel stop building, not because they can't build or communicate, but because they no longer share the same unquestioned assumptions. Ecclesiastes. The hum emerges from silence. In Babel, The hum disappears under the noise of collective ego. When everyone is shouting the same slogan, repeating the same narrative, chasing the same tower, the internal signal becomes inaudible. Babel is what happens when a society's delusion becomes so loud that an individual can no longer hear their own internal hum. Gathering of the people is not a curse, it's a reset. When uniformity breaks, individuality returns, discernment returns, diversity of thought returns, and the ability to question returns. The collapse of Babel is the restoration of inner sovereignty. It's like the universe is saying, you cannot outsource meaning. You cannot mass produce identity. You cannot build your own way into heaven. And we still build Babel in institutions, in ideologies, in corporations, in political movements, in online echo chambers, and in spiritual communities. Anytime a group says, let us make a name for ourselves, the blueprint of Babel reappears. Anytime a collective chases visibility and reputation instead of truth, the tower rises again. And anytime a society worships its own creations, particularly belief creations, coherence collapses. The antidote to Babel is not dispersion, it's discernment. It's the courage to think independently, to question collective narratives, to resist the seduction of spectacle, to stay aligned with the hum, and to build inward before building outward. So, in conclusion, Babel is the story of what happens when a society tries to ascend before awakening. It shows us the danger of a mind, or a culture for that matter, that mistakes outward appearances and reputation for truth and confuses the illusion of unity with the work of alignment. The scattering isn't punishment, it's mercy. It's the restoration of plurality, the return of discernment, the reopening of the inner dialogue that makes wisdom possible. And this is where the story pivots, because the Bible doesn't leave us in the ruins of Babel. It immediately turns to the figure who embodies the opposite pattern, not a man who happens to be wise, but the archetype of wisdom itself, the part of the psyche that stays aligned when everything around it descends into chaos. If Babel is the story of collective folly, then Noah is the story of wisdom preserved. If Babel shows us what collapses when consciousness fragments, then Noah shows us what survives when consciousness aligns. And that's where we go next. Thanks for watching.